So, is that much better? Yeah. Shall I start again? I'll kind of summarise what I've said so far. So, I said how nice it was to be here and how daunting it was to give the lecture. And I also said that what this lecture is about class fits. And the reason it's about class fits is that a lot of people who read my stuff on New Wars accused me of being post-class fits. And class fits, I've also said, so I'm repeating for those people who could hear me, Clausewitz was a very, very important military strategic thinker in the early 19th century, and his book on war is the military strategy classic. It's a little bit like the Bible. Everybody who works out their strategy in the military have to refer to Clausewitz and use some Clausewitzian term like the centre of gravity or the Trinity. And so to accuse somebody of post-Clausewitzian is quite a strong accusation. So I decided to spend a summer reading Clausewitz and the commentaries to discover whether I was post-Clausewitzian. And what I discovered was that I am indeed post-Clausewitzian, but not for the reasons that people have attributed to me. And so what I'm going to do today is really to explain to you why Clausewitz's theory, why I disagree with it, and then I want to talk about some of the other aspects of his theory, which are the reasons people usually say I'm post-Clausewitzian. Just one thing to say, I mean, it was actually a very enjoyable exercise that on war I highly recommend because it's actually very readable. And on every page there's some interesting insight and wonderful quote. So you enjoy it a lot. So if anybody feels like getting into this subject, it's quite good fun. So let me start. The reason I'm post-Clausewitzian is really fundamentally because I disagree with Clausewitz's theory of war. And his theory of war is actually contained in the first chapter of the first book, which is the only one he thought he'd finished. He actually died of cholera in 1816, I think, and the same epidemic that killed off Hegel. And his wife put together his notes afterwards. What he's famous for, and I will say that war is an instrument of politics, for saying that war is rational, and I will talk about that later, but actually I think his fundamental theory of war resides somewhere else. So what is his fundamental theory of war? Well, he has a theory. For Clausewitz, there are two sorts of war, and these aren't empirical categories, they're theoretical categories. And one is absolute war, and the other is real war. And absolute war is what you might call an ideal concept. I mean, he was writing at the time of Hegel, just shortly after Kant. So, and his idea was that if you defined war, you could deduce a logic of war from the definition. And real war is what actually happens in practice. And it's the tension between the ideal and the real in which his theory of war resides. So, what was his definition of war? His definition of war was, war is an act of violence. I haven't got a blackboard, otherwise I'd write it down. Designed to compel an opponent to fulfill our will. And what he derives, in other words, for Clausewitz, war is a contest of wills. And what follows from this definition of war is that war tends to extreme. He talks about the three reciprocal actions as each one tries to impose their will on the other. And that's his central theory of war, that war tends to extreme and this can be logically deduced from the nature of war. Violence, he says, is the means through which we impose our will on the opponent. And this has to lead to the extreme use of violence. Here I was going to give you my first quote. Now, philanthropists may easily imagine there is a skillful method of disarming and overcoming an enemy without causing great bloodshed. However plausible this may appear, still it is an error which must be extirpated. For in such dangerous things as war, the errors which proceed from the spirit of benevolence are the worst. As the use of physical power to the utmost extent by no means excludes the cooperation of intelligence, it follows that he who uses forces unsparingly without reference to the bloodshed involved must obtain a superiority if his adversary uses less vigour in its application. The former then dictates the law to the latter, and both proceed to extremities, to which the only limitations are those imposed by the amount of counteracting force on each side. And then he says, real war is a little bit different from absolute war. It maybe isn't as absolute as this, for several reasons. One might be political, that the politicians simply don't think the bloodshed is worth the goal, so there might be inadequate political backing. Or it could be what he calls friction, which is what really happens in war, the fog of war. It's bad weather, difficult terrain, logistics, poor logistics, those kinds of things which are inevitable in war and which slows down war. So those are his two types of war. Now, a lot of recent writers on Clausewitz have claimed actually he didn't only think that wars tended to extreme, and actually he had a concept of limited. Michael Howard and Peter Parrott, in the introduction to their translation, found a note of 1827, which they claimed he was going to rewrite on war. Oh, no, so it must have been 1830 he died, sorry about that. 1827, in which he said he was planning to rewrite on war, looking at the difference between limited and unlimited wars. And then Beatrice Heuser's book about Clausewitz makes exactly the same point. They insist, and Hugh Strawn, who's the great Clausewitz scholar, says, look, Clausewitz wrote a lot about small wars. He wrote about the guerrillas in the Napoleonic Wars, so surely he wasn't only looking at absolute wars. But actually, my view is, apart from thinking that we have to take the text as it is and not what people like to impute to Clausewitz, that actually even when he deals with limited wars, he assumes they have an inner tendency to extreme, and it's only because of politics or friction that they aren't actually unlimited. And that's confirmed by a full reading of the book. The book is all about battle. It's all about combat as the decisive moment. It's all about fighting. That's what the book is about, page after page. And I could give you endless quotes, but I thought I would give you one which just gives you a feeling of how he writes. Here on this spot, in this very hour, to conquer the enemy is the purpose in which the plan of war with all its threads converge, in which distant hopes or dim glimmerings of the future meet. Fate steps in to give an answer to the bold question. So that's his description of battle. And also he spends pages and pages and pages on two issues, suspension and defence, because according to his theory, war shouldn't ever be suspended. It's a contradiction in terms, so why is war suspended? And he has all sorts of explanations. One is, which is how he explains 18th century wars, which he describes as shriveled up, half-in-half wars. He says it's just politicians are too timid, they're afraid of mobilising, difficult to establish a victory unless you're prepared to kill everybody. And so it makes war as a contest of wills much, much more difficult. But the second thing is that I think even though war, mutual annihilation, is sort of impossible, war serves other functions. It may help for political reasons or for economic reasons, and that's where I'm going to give you some examples to explain what I mean. Just one point, going backwards a little bit, about Clausewitz's theory of war. For Clausewitz, the Napoleonic Wars were really the proof that absolute war existed. And he felt the key, he fought in the Napoleonic Wars on the Prussian side and being defeated, and was incredibly frustrated by that whole experience. And he felt that Napoleon had hit upon a discovery which made absolute war a reality. And he says, and here I'm going to give you another quote, "We might doubt whether our notion of its absolute character or nature was founded in reality if we had not seen real warfare make its appearance in this absolute completeness just in our own times. After a short introduction performed by the French Revolution, the impetuous Bonaparte quickly brought it to this point. Under him, it was carried out without slackening for a moment until the enemy was frustrated and a counterstroke followed with as little remission. Is it not natural that this phenomenon should lead us back to the original conception of war with all its rigorous deductions?" So he felt the Napoleonic War really proved his theory. And of course, in the 20th century, we had the First and Second World Wars, which in a way took that theory even further. And so I suppose when I say now that I think wars reached a point at that moment when in a way you couldn't go along that further track. So it's not that we limited because of the track, it's just that it's not relevant at all. So what are the other functions that war serves? Well, it helps to prop up politics, and it can help in economic ways, or it can do the opposite, it can change international orders. But let me give you two examples, both of which I give in my New Wars book. The first is about identity politics. New wars are very much fought for identity politics, and I think my point really is that the kind of extremist identities you see in sectarian conflicts actually, far from being the cause of war, are an outcome of war. The violence creates the kind of fear and hate that makes people feel they have to belong to exclusive identities. That, if you like, the entrepreneurs of violence, the warring parties, through becoming people's protectors, through creating insecurity, are able, often come from extreme ends of the political spectrum, but are able to become mainstream through the process of fighting. Now, and that was very much the case, for example, in Bosnia, where the extremist Muslims and extremist Croats and Serbs became mainstream through creating a situation of fear. Similarly in Baghdad with the Sunnis and the Shia. And even in Israel-Palestine, you can't understand how the emergence of the Israeli right and Hamas has occurred throughout a long process, except for understanding their role in violence and the way they're able to emerge out of war. So war helps to create a kind of polarizing identity. It strengthens extremist ideas. In war, you feel yourself to be a Serb because somebody wants to kill you because you're a Serb or a Muslim. Normally you might feel yourself to be a mother, a professor, I'm not a Serb, but whatever it is, a grandmother. But those things suddenly become unimportant if somebody wants to kill you. And actually what you see typically happening is a kind of mobilization around the political narrative. So war and insecurity helps to sustain that. That's one kind of argument. But another kind of argument is economic. In contemporary wars, these are situations where states are weak, where taxation is very low, and where the warring parties enrich themselves, or rather finance themselves, through a whole variety of illegal activities, whether it's loot and pillage, whether it's drug smuggling, as in Afghanistan, oil smuggling, as in Iraq, diamond smuggling, as in Sierra Leone, or whether it's or human trafficking, as in the Balkans, or just taxing humanitarian aid, or getting support from the diaspora. And after, a lot of scholars have suggested that new wars are actually motivated by economic activities, and they're purely criminal. My own view is that a war is not a war unless it is framed politically. But to know whether the individual motive was economic or political is very unclear. What is true is that for some actors, the economic activities are needed to fund the politics, and for others, the politics are needed to legitimise the economic activities. But in any case, it kind of establishes a predatory political economy in which the actors have a vested interest in sustaining it. So what I'm arguing is that if war is a mutual enterprise rather than a contest of wills, its inner tendency is for wars without end rather than wars that tend to the extreme. Its inner tendency is not to be limitless, but to be inconclusive. And of course, in making this kind of argument, it's very difficult to establish these are wars that are two-sided, they're wars that are reciprocal, although the reciprocal actions are merely ways of justifying the next reciprocal action. And they each require the other side, they require the enemy to sustain the war, they require the attack in order to justify the next attack, and so on. But of course that's very, very difficult to establish because that's not what the actors say. The actors say they really want to defeat the other, and perhaps they really do believe that. And so it's an interpretation, and the test of this interpretation really is what it implies for policy and which policy approach works better. Let me give you the example of the war on terror. Now, one of the Clausewitzian scholars who, I have to find it, I can't remember, one of the Clausewitzian scholars who is criticising me suggests that, suggests that the war on terror could be described in typical Clausewitzian terms, and he says, both antagonists seek the political destruction of the other, and at this point neither seems open to negotiated settlement. But if you interpret it in Clausewitzian terms, it's very difficult to imagine that the West could ever defeat the terrorists or the terrorists could ever defeat the West. And the assumption is you go on building up on both sides. If you interpret it in my terms as a mutual enterprise, then the argument is that the United States leads a long war to justify its role as the defender of democracy, as a political narrative that's required domestically in the American context, to justify new increases in military spending, and the terrorists need a long war in order to mobilise extremist Islamic youth and to show that global jihad is a reality and not just an imagined invention. If you interpret it in that way, then the implication for what you do for policy is quite different. You say, well, look, let's take terrorism seriously, but let's not deal with it militarily. Let's deal with it through policing and intelligence. Let's try to think about a different way of thinking about the global situation beyond the war on terror. So the real test of the interpretation, in a way, is policy. I think one way of looking at this is that you could say it's rather like the difference between a realist would argue that wars are by two sides, and each side is, if you like, treated as an individual with motivation. And so those are the only two possible candidates for a model. Whereas the constructionist would say each side is the product of bureaucracy, politics, social relationships, and therefore the motivation has to be understood within that context, rather than as two rational individuals playing a game. And if you think about it that way, maybe wars were always like this. Certainly, if you read Rousseau and Kant, they believed that states went to war in order to increase their power domestically, that the whole point of going to war externally was to suppress your own population. And so, is this the same as what I mean by new wars? Well, I think my definition of new wars was not as a mutual enterprise, although that is the implication of my argument. It was about identity politics and economics, but I do think it applies. It's at a different level of abstraction. And I suppose what you could say is a realist interpretation was maybe more appropriate in a Westphalian era. And we now need a different kind of interpretation of war to understand what's going on now. And this is a point that I often make when people criticise the new war thesis by saying that actually new wars aren't really new. My point in calling them new is to distinguish them from our idea of old war, which was regular forces meeting together in a clash, battle being the decisive encounter, states being the key actors. And I didn't want to imply, and how could I have done, that all features of new war were new. They are certainly, many of them, very old. So that's basically my argument about the theory, why I disagree with the theory of Clausewitz. But what I've left to one side are all the things people usually know Clausewitz for. And in the few remaining minutes that I have, I'm going to talk about those factors. And really, I would say there are three of them. One is about the Trinity. And the military are very fond of the Trinity. The Trinity is supposed to be composed of the state, the politicians, the generals, and the people. And wars are fought by the Trinity. And so some scholars have said contemporary wars are non-Trinitarian because they're fought by mixtures of state and non-state actors. That's the first set of issues. The second set of issues is that Clausewitz says in many places war is an instrument of politics. And many scholars, particularly those who say war is really criminal violence, are arguing that politics is less important. And the third argument is that Clausewitz makes the point that war is rational. And many people say, well, these contemporary conflicts we see are irrational. So let me deal with each of those arguments in turn. The first point is about the Trinity. I think in a trivial sense, if you think of the Trinity as the state, the generals, and the people, obviously it doesn't apply because we don't have those clear distinctions. Contemporary conflicts are fought by mixtures of state and non-state actors, warlords, militias, private security contractors. But actually what Clausewitz says is not that the Trinity is composed of institutions. What he says is that the Trinity is composed of emotions. And he says, which may be, so what are the emotions? The original, its elements, hatred and animosity, which may be looked upon as blind instinct, the play of probabilities and chance, which make it a free activity of the soul, and of the subordinate nature of a political instrument by which it belongs to pure reason. And what he saw was that these emotions, hatred and animosity, chance and probability and reason, mainly, and his word was mainly, resided in each of these levels. So hatred and animosity was typical of the people, chance and probability was typical of the generals who were making all these calculations, and reason resided in the politicians. And I'll come back to what he meant by reason in a minute. But, I think if any of you are familiar at all with Hegel, and he was living in Berlin at exactly the same time, even though he never actually attributes anything to Hegel. Hegel was making the same sort of argument, that reason belonged to the state, The family was that place of private emotions, and civil society was the mixture of emotions in between. So he's more interested in how these emotions come together, and that war is a way in which you bring together these different emotions. And in that sense, I think it's a really useful concept, actually, because the same thing happens in the conflicts that we're talking about, that people fight wars for a whole variety of reasons. It may be personal vendettas, it may be glory, it may be jealousy, it may be that they actually believe it's politically the right thing to do. But they all unite and come together under a single narrative of what the war is about. So in that sense, I think the Trinity is rather a useful concept, so I don't disagree with that. The second issue is war, says Clausewitz, is an instrument of politics. And actually the term that Clausewitz uses in Germany is Politik, which can be translated into English as either policy or politics. And it's usually interpreted in English as policy. In other words, the state is there and it has a policy vis-a-vis, I don't know, America has a policy vis-a-vis the terrorists, and it's using violence to fulfill its policy. Whereas if you think about the way that I've been interpreting it, it's much more to do with politics. It's to do with political mobilization around identity. And it's certainly true that for Clausewitz, and if you're talking about a contest of wills, what Napoleon did was political mobilization around an external policy. And what I'm talking about is almost exactly the other way around, that the framing of the conflict is a means to political mobilization, and the object of the conflict is political mobilization. But whether you're talking about politics in the sense of political mobilization or politics in the sense of some particular goal, I think it is the case that these conflicts are political. And I would therefore have no disagreement with the idea. I think if a war is not political, it's not a war. The essence of what it means to be a war is that it's political, because what it does by calling itself a war, it turns the soldier into a legitimate agent. It gives them a justification. You'll notice if you watch jihadi suicide videos, they will always say, I'm a soldier for jihad. They wouldn't say, I'm a criminal murderer for jihad. And the difference between war and crime is that. So, for war to be politics is what legitimizes it, and that's why I think the politics then takes on a life of its own and becomes very important. So I don't have a problem with war as an instrument of politics there. I think Clausewitz is right. And then the third issue is about rationality. And if we think of rationality as instrumental rationality, that means that you have a goal and you work out the best means, whether it's good or bad or anything, then obviously, again, such wars, I think, are instrumentally rational. If you look, for instance, at the pattern of ethnic cleansing in a place like Bosnia or Baghdad, the end game was to create ethnically clean territories where extremist Serbs or Croats or Sunnis or Shia could win elections. There was a clear political goal in what they were doing. And so it was obviously instrumentally rational. But if you think about this a little bit more, I think Clausewitz uses the term reason. And if you think about it at the time that he was writing, reason meant something more than rationality. It related to the idea of reasoning and the public use of reason. Clausewitz puts a huge emphasis on cabinet government, and as does Hegel. And Hegel says the state acts on the basis of reason. And what does that mean? And I think what it means is that in a situation where there's a cabinet debate, people have to present their arguments as public arguments. You may want to go to war because you think you're going to get a medal or make lots of money, but you wouldn't say that in cabinet. You would make a proper argument that could be presented to the public. And the debate that comes out of the cabinet about whether to go to war or not is supposed to represent the public interest. And that's what I think was meant by reason. For Hegel, he talked about reason representing universal values in contrast to the private sphere, where people were motivated by individual values. So civil society was somehow the reconciliation of individual and public values. And so I think, of course, universal values here referred to the citizens of the state rather than universalism. So I think Clausewitz meant reason in that sense. And interestingly enough, one of the people who does call himself post-Clausewitzian is Martin van Creveld, who wrote a book called The Transformation of War. And van Creveld says what Clausewitz ignores is the real importance of what he calls the War Convention, the body of laws that are associated with contemporary war. And I think he's right, because I think actually the international laws of war reflect this idea of reason and are absolutely necessary for soldiers to feel that they're soldiers. I mean, it may be different, it may be something to do with religion in the case of jihadism, but you know, to feel that you're a hero and not a criminal, that you're not a murderer, but you're a brave, courageous person. The fact that you operate within the laws of war is very, very important. And so you could argue that the War Convention is somehow based on a notion of reason. And I think what happens with contemporary wars, new wars, is that they're rational but not reasonable. They do terrible things that violate not only the laws of war, but also human rights law, ethnic cleansing, genocide, torture, and all of those things. So I think if Clausewitz did mean reason, then it's very difficult to argue that these mutual enterprises are reasonable. I mean, there was a notion at his time that there was such a thing as state reason for going to war, and the state could justify a war if it was in the interests of the state. I think that really doesn't apply. And so in that sense, one could argue the implications of this argument are profound in terms of how you think about any specific conflict. Of course, I'm not saying that there is no element of contest of wills, and in fact, if you started from my point of view, you could easily make a Clausewitzian argument that real war differs from this model because people do start to hate each other and real goals happen, so they really try to kill each other, and so real war may turn out to be more extreme than the theory would suggest. But I think it's a way of thinking about war that allows you to think about the future in different ways. I wanted to end really with one last point about, if you like, I really haven't talked about global governance and the nation state and the context in which we live, and whether you could argue that the UN Security Council is sort of the equivalent of the cabinet in Clausewitz's day, where even though each country have their own personal motives, the fact they have to publicly debate issues like intervention in Libya, for example, is the nearest thing we have to the public use of reason. But I just thought it would be nice to quote you, because the interesting thing is, having painted Clausewitz as an extremist warrior and realist, he was very interesting on all this. He was very sceptical about the balance of power. The theory at that time was that what maintained the balance of power in Europe was the idea, what maintained peace in Europe was the idea of the balance of power. And he thought it was not the balance of power that maintained stability, but interconnectedness. And I was going to give you one last quote making this point, if I can only find it. I've got my pages into the... Here we are. If, for instance, we look at the various states composing Europe at the present time, we find, without speaking of a systematically regulated balance of power and interests, as that does not exist, and therefore is often with justice disputed. that the great and small states and interested nations are interwoven with each other in a most diversified and changeable manner, each of these points of intersection forming a binding knot. In this manner, the whole relations of all states to each other serve rather to preserve the stability of the whole than to produce changes. That is to say, this tendency to stability exists in general. This we conceive to be a true notion of balance of power, and in this sense it will always of itself come into existence whenever there are extensive connections between civilized states. And that's a rather nice note on which to end, because here we are in the middle of a terrible economic crisis, a great disjuncture, and at past disjunctures of this kind, we've had terrible wars. And the question is, are we going to avoid that? Are we going to have something like, I don't know, a long new war with terrible things going on in the Middle East or in the peripheral of Europe? Or are the extensive connections enough to prevent that? And how would we prepare for that in a way that's very different from what was done in the past? It's just leaving you with a question. Thank you. There is a resurgence of violent nationalism in Europe. We saw these terrible events in Oslo when a young man killed all the people on the summer camp. We've seen Jobbik getting a third of the votes in Hungary, a very extreme right-wing anti-Semitic party. The True Finns in Finland, the Democrats in Sweden. So I think there really is a resurgence of extremist nationalism. My view is that it won't take the form of wars between states on the model of the World War II. Rather, these movements will be using identity politics, if you like, to win elections and creating more and more violence to create more and more sense of insecurity. And the extent to which they become important rather than an alternative, I think, is really a political question. I think it's partly a question about what happens to the Eurozone and whether the Euro is saved and what happens to the future of Europe, but also partly a question about people like you. I mean, I think the fact that there is this new protest movement, that people are going out in the streets and people aren't quite sure what they're calling for. So they're very sort of vulnerable to be mobilised by nationalists, but they could equally well be mobilised in support of a sort of more cosmopolitan social justice movement. And I think this is a moment when everybody really has to be engaged very deeply to prevent this from happening. I think the jury is out on that last question. I mean, why I think international justice is so important, because I think the peace idea is that you bring extremists together. The justice idea is that you undermine the position of the extremists by showing that what they're doing is completely unacceptable and illegal. So, and I think the justice route actually in the end will, if you accept my mutual enterprise argument, then the justice route is more likely to end wars than the classic peace route of having talks between two sides. On international justice, there is no question that there are big problems with international justice, if only because it's so one-sided. On the other hand, I think the jury's out. I mean, my view as somebody who studies the Balkans is that actually international justice has been very important and one of the most positive things in the Balkans, that it has generated local debates within Serbia and Croatia and Bosnia. It has, I mean, I know there are disagreements on that, but that's my view. It has actually stimulated a movement for reconciliation in all of the Balkan states. It has led to domestic cases being taken in Serbia. So I actually think it has, over time, had quite an impact. There's a lot to be thought through around this, because I do think it's very problematic, the way it's one-sided, the way it picks on particular people. I mean, there was a big debate over Libya, whether it was right to indict Gaddafi and Saif Gaddafi and Sanusi. And the Peace Brigade were arguing it's a real mistake because we need to have negotiations with them. My argument was the Peace Brigade don't understand politics. That, you know, those guys are never going to leave. The real issue is, can you influence others so they don't continue to support them? And indicting them actually exposes the lack of justice. Now, of course, that's problematic if Bush and Blair aren't indicted, and it is seen as one-sided, and it is seen as a victor's call. But nevertheless, I think, and again, you know, a study by a colleague of mine in Uganda finds that local people were actually very pleased to have the International Criminal Court, while many of the donors were arguing we should have local courts and we should have traditional courts. Many ordinary people felt really relieved that international standards had been introduced into their societies. So I think this is a very good research topic. This is something that really needs to be studied. But my intuitive argument, which derives from my argument about war as a mutual enterprise, is that justice is key.